Good afternoon, everyone, once again, and welcome to this week's Mastering Blueforce Weekly Series webinar. This webinar will be focusing on basic payroll readiness and overtime. Now, as we do with all of our sessions, we do have everyone currently muted. So if you do me a favor, if you have any questions or concerns, please do me a favor, key those into the question area of the control panel there shown to the right-hand side of your screen. And then once you go in there, put in your question, hit send, and I'll address that question or concern at the appropriate time in our conversations. Now, just as a quick reminder, we do these sessions every Tuesday and Thursday until further notice at 2 p.m. Central. So pass the word on to your fellow team members. And also as a reminder, we do record these webinars for your future review on YouTube, as well as provide documentation as relates to these webinars. Now, for this webinar in question today, we are going to be discussing the basic payroll readiness, just kind of go through some basic steps as it involves getting your payroll ready, and then focusing on OT and overtime processes. So first, we'll discuss the OT process. We're going to go through and just kind of detail for you how Blueforce is calculating or determining overtime. What's overtime, how many hours, what are the rules, etc. Then we're going to go through some basic payroll readiness. We'll go through some basic tips for those submitters and approvers on the phone call. And we'll address some ways editors can assist the submitters and approvers. And then as we go through that portion of basic payroll readiness, I'm going to do a live demo of submitting a timesheet. I think we have some questions, still have some concerns about the fastest way, the best way of doing the submission of timesheets. So I'm going to address that on today's webinar. So let's get started. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and start with the overtime process. Now, the overtime process is very, very cut and dry. Overtime is something that is governed as a federal and state rule, obviously. State law, we cannot go around it. So the question that always comes up out of overtime is how and why does Blueforce calculate overtime? Well, as I mentioned, the federal overtime provision is contained as part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is basically referred to as the FLSA. And part of that is for any non-exempt employees, which is a majority of our our team and our staff. For the most part, the general rule is that we have to pay overtime, and overtime has to be at least time and a half, 1.5 times the employee's regular rate of pay after 40 hours in a work week. Now, that is the baseline rule that's out there. Now, from that, each state can go through and adjust that rule accordingly. So I'm kind of giving that example of state rules, as like California may choose to go a different route. They did. They actually have a rule that says that the employees there must be paid after 8 hours in a day, and then there's some double time rules that kick in after so many hours, etc. So there's a lot of other things that can be accomplished or kind of pulled out from the basic rule. So we, as part of the EPAY team, we have to make sure that all the rules are actually running correctly in Blueforce. Now, the next question that comes up, kind of more to that, is what do we do? I mean, if the state does have a different rule, do we go with the federal rule or the state rule? Well, the state rule in just about every case outweighs the federal rule there of the basic 40 hours in a work week. And secondly, you got to keep in mind that you also have maybe a union rule that also can dictate overtime. So I'll address that here momentarily. But in both cases, in cases where an employee is subject to both state and federal overtime rules, the employee is typically entitled to the overtime according to the higher standard. And the higher standard normally is driven by that state rule, because most states will then determine that they want a different standard. So that's why in California instance we do the California rule. But the standard that will be provide the higher overtime pay is the key here to keep in mind. So furthermore with that, the FLSA that we were talking about will provide the ground floor requirements. So as I mentioned, that is the baseline requirement. Now, if we're dealing with a union and a collective bargaining, or is referred to as a CBA, is involved, then that might actually provide a different rate in certain situations. So the CBA may define overtime as working more than 35 hours in a week. Now, if the state and say federal rules say 40 hours in a work week, the CBA says 35, we actually go with the CBA rule in this case, because most unions are going to actually have their own rulings and want to enforce their rules on our employees and employee time. So if an employer in this scenario were to work 36 hours, that employee must be paid the overtime wage listed in that CBA, which once again, there might be a specific overtime wage, not necessarily time and a half. More than likely it is time and a half, but sometimes it may be a little different based on what they wrote up. And the OT rate does not necessarily have to be 1.5 times the employee's wages, because the rate only applies for work performed beyond 40 hours. I bring that up for those that have unions, because there are a few unions out there that do request or require that overtime be paid at a different hour threshold. So in that case, keep in mind that we only have to pay time and a half per the federal rule, which is beyond 40 hours or more. If the overtime, if maybe there was an overtime rule, it strictly went to a double time situation, then since the double time situation pays better, the overtime rule would then be waived and we have to pay the double time standard. So bottom line, kind of when you're dealing with the different overtime rules that we have out there, we always go with what's more advantageous or better for the employee. Now the rate in the CBA could be lower or higher. I think you kind of figure that out as kind of a discussion, but bottom line, unions can be very complex and a little bit more difficult to work with, just depending on the specific rules. Now, one thing to keep in mind, regardless of which way we're doing overtime, overtime cannot be ignored. So we cannot make a side deal with the employee and say, you know what, work a couple extra hours for me, it's overtime, understand, but I'll take care of you with an extra day off later, or I'll go in and, you know, pay, we'll add a few extra hours at regular rate next payroll. That is actually illegal, and we cannot do that. So if overtime is earned, it must be paid per the OT rules. Now, if the employee works overtime, then they are entitled to OT pay, no exceptions. Now, I put that line in this document, this presentation today, because there is a rule that's, a law that is currently being kind of discussed and argued between the House and the Senate right now. And that rule right now will allow, if depending on the employee or employer, there's some little disagreement still going back and forth between the House and Senate on how to pay overtime. So there's going to be some changes to the overtime rule in which we could actually possibly, as of right now it's not in law, but possibly we could be looking at paying the employee in lieu of paying the employee overtime pay. We could actually be looking at paying them additional time off or giving them additional hours. So for example, if they work 4 hours overtime, the opportunity there is for the employee to maybe waive the overtime pay and say they want 4 extra hours of personal time later down the road. So that is something right now for those that are on the call from our Canada locations. Canada, the country of Canada has that rule already in play. So we deal with that in Blueforce now. However, that might be something new in the U.S. in the coming year or so. So stay tuned. We'll keep you posted once we hear anything. But right now, we still have to pay overtime based on the OT rule. Now, kind of the way overtime works, for those that may not be familiar, everything goes through the pay group. And I know a lot of you, everyone on this phone call has heard the word pay group multiple times, probably ad nauseum come payroll time. But the pay group is a grouping of like employees with similar rules that would be applied come to the end of your pay period. So one of the tabs on this pay group setup that we look at is this overtime policy tab. Now let me just clarify for everybody. This is a screen from Blueforce. However, I will tell you that not everyone here has access to seeing this. Actually, frankly, only if you're an admin and a member of our EPAY team here at corporate would you be able to have access to seeing this overtime policy. But bottom line, the way this works is once we set up the pay groups for you in the system, we have to tag a OT rule. So part of the initial setup of a pay group, we always ask, what are the overtime rules? And do you have some documentation behind that so we can verify that it's correct? So in doing that, we go through there, we set up the overtime. And in this case, you'll notice that in the middle of the screen here, it does say the overtime rule is basically on a weekly basis for 40 hours in the first week, 40 hours in the second week. That's basically telling us that this is a bi-weekly payroll. So we have a rule that looks at 40 hours in each work week. Anything over 40 or in excess of 40, it's going to be paid out at the overtime rate. So this is just a side note I just want to show you on the side screen so you can kind of see what we did when we set up overtime in the system. Now, if there was maybe a double time rule like California does, we may have a double time here that says daily hours over, I believe it's over 12 in a day, and there's a couple different other rules that are in place. I always get confused with California and some other states, but bottom line, we have some other levels we can do, just depending on what the scenario is that's requested by that particular state or municipality, or even union, sorry. So going through that, once again, it is important that whenever we set up pay groups, and typically we only set up pay groups when there is maybe a new union involved or a new ruling that will affect employees. And when we set that, we'll ask some questions. One of the big questions is, what is the OT rules surrounding these employees? Now, keep in mind that once the pay group is set up with those rules, the OT policy is applied automatically. So whatever you see in the system and employees being paid overtime, I can really just say, you can argue all day and say that the rule is incorrect, but if the rule is truly set up the way we need it set up, it's going to be applied appropriately, and the overtime will be paid accordingly. So there's no user intervention required. Once it's set up, the system's automatically checking overtime consistently. And the way it works is once the employee punches in, and then the employee has a matched out punch, the system will then automatically calculate that total time and send it over the timesheet view. The timesheet view is where you would see the overtime calculated, like it shows here in this screen. So you'll see here that Alan Ryan, in my example, had regular time on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And then on Friday, up to Thursday, he had 37 hours. But going into Friday, based on a 40-hour work week overtime rule in this example, he worked 3 hours on Friday, at which point he hit the overtime marker. Any hours over that 40, in this case with the 6 hours, are not going to be denoted as overtime on Friday. So the way the system works, it basically flows through the hours of every job, and once the employee hits that magic threshold, the system will automatically start applying overtime. The example here, like I said, is based on that 40-hour work week. He had worked total 46 hours that week, 6 hours is overtime. Now, I'll explain a little bit some options on overtime and kind of how it's calculating here momentarily. But bottom line, straight out of the box, the way to work, 40-hour work week, in this case, 6 hours of overtime. Now, we do have a setting in the system that will typically allow time to go to the employee's non-default job. Now, in this case, Alan Ryan worked one job. He just worked at one job, 5007883, all week. But we do have employees that do float around, that do work multiple jobs. And when they work multiple jobs, that obviously leads to possibly getting overtime charged to a job that may or may not be able to afford that overtime. And the example typically happens when an employee works at the beginning of a work week on Saturday and Sunday, and then maybe he's picking up some extra hours at a job, filling in elsewhere, and then works his normal job Monday through Friday. So saying that, those first 2 days of the work week might be at a job that, like I said, he's filling in for, and might be able to absorb that overtime cost. And typically, if he was working those extra jobs on Saturday and Sunday, the overtime is going to probably fall in that normal job that he worked during he works on a normal work week. So to that point, there is a setting also on the pay group level that we have set up right now as kind of as our default when we set up a pay group. We set up this one, and it's called give priority to non-default jobs when calculating overtime. What that basically says is the priority is going to go to those jobs that are not part of his default job, and give those jobs the priority of getting and garnishing and gathering up all of those overtime hours first before the actual overtime is spread on the normal employee's default job. Now, this is a setting that's been in place because we typically would say if the employee's not working their default job, maybe possibility is that they're working to get extra hours, or maybe they're covering for somebody else, maybe they're simply working like a one-time job scenario where it's not a default job, they're picking up extra revenue for us. So give priority to non-default jobs will be just that. It's actually giving that priority to those jobs that are not his default job as shown here on his or her employee profile. So everyone on this call does have access to seeing the employee profile. You can go to any employee. You can view any bits of it, most of the information on the employee profile. And this is actually right off the first screen. Once I go to the employee profile, open up that employee, right there in the payroll section, I do have the default job shown here as it shows over in JD Edwards. So the default slide here is just letting you know that default job is job 100. And anything under over here in his working jobs, job 102, 105, and then these other 3 jobs at the bottom are his non-default jobs. So kind of that rule is working is if this employee is working, job 105, job 19, job 23, job 44 in the weekend and gathering a lot of hours, the system is going to know that during that work week, when he goes back to his normal regular job of job 100, he's probably going to hit overtime. So what the system will do is it'll try to force any overtime back to those weekend jobs, to those non-default jobs, and apply the priority overtime there first. So it's just as a fail-safe so we can make sure that the true traditional default job for that employee doesn't get the hit. So that is kind of the overtime process as it sits in the system right now. It's all automatic. There's no intervention needed by the employee or the Blueforce user. But the one thing I will stress that I don't have a slide for here today, and I'll just stress it without documenting here, is just keep in mind that you do not have to, and you're actually urged not to, change the overtime rate type. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the overtime is only shown at the timesheet level. And I'll show you some examples here momentarily when I do a live demo, but when you go to the timesheet, that is where you see the overtime. You never will see it over on the time card. Now, once it's assigned to overtime, it's because the system has generated and put it there. We also urge you, do not force overtime on an actual employee record. If you mark an employee record overtime, for example, say the employee comes in and works 8 hours on Saturday and Sunday on a non-default or say a second job for the employee, and then on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, the employee works 8 hours as well at their regular job. Well, now if I do that example, he's working 7 days a week, he'll have 56 hours. 16 of that is going to be overtime, okay? The system is actually going to go, based on that non-default setting, it's going to automatically put that overtime to the non-default jobs initially first anyhow. So there's no intervention on your part. However, if let's say that employee does come in, and the intention is he's going to work every day of the week, that second job on Saturday, Sunday, 8 hours each, and then Monday through Friday his regular job. However, he gets sick on Tuesday and doesn't come in the rest of the week. If you preemptively go in there and mark those hours as overtime for the weekend, because you already know that he's going to get overtime, so I might as well go mark it and change the rate type there. If you do that, and let's say he does not fulfill a 40-hour work week or whatever the rule may be, that overtime is, I guess, unnecessarily forced, and that employee would get paid time and a half for those hours when he really didn't earn that overtime in the first place. Now, for those on the phone call who have Hubble, we do have a report out there when you actually drill down into the compliance dashboard. You can actually go through there and see it'll identify those specific scenarios where overtime was forced, and that's kind of a good detail for you. But I don't have an example of that on this particular webinar. I just want to point that out for those that are doing that. And we'll have some Hubble classes here in the next couple of weeks that we will actually detail that piece along with some of the new features of Hubble. But bottom line, that is kind of the overall time process as it stands right now in Blueforce. So how does that actually roll into our payroll readiness? So kind of keep in mind that when we do our payroll, there are some key steps that all of us on this phone call, editors, submitters, and approvers, should be doing to make this process a quick and easy day for you. And you know, really, the payroll process should not last 2 to 3 days like many of us are actually spending on it. It should actually be come in Monday, do it, and be done with it. It should be a quick process. Now, from an editor standpoint, for the editors that are on the phone call, if you have that editor role, you should be going in there and making sure you review your time daily. If you're reviewing your time daily, there really is no question or no real major issues come payroll time because we've accounted for everybody. We've made sure that they've punched in and punched out. We've made sure that the time card in Blueforce is recorded a time in and time out for every employee. And we've also noted any days off. Maybe they're entitled to vacation pay, or maybe we've identified other scenarios where time wasn't, entered the system via the employee themselves. It was something that you have to do manually. Maybe like they forgot to punch in, or simply they had to run an errand and you were going to punch them in into the system. But bottom line, if you're doing daily time review, you'll catch those anomalies on a day-to-day review. And once again, the day-to-day review is nothing more than really a 5-minute, 10-minute top exercise of going in there and looking at all the exceptions, seeing that everyone was there, making sure that all the time was captured. Now, when it comes down to the next step of once that time is in the system, how do you know when your payroll is ready to go? So that leaves all submitters and all approvers that are now on this phone call to now have the tools to complete the required steps. Now, notice the next 3 bullets, open-ended bullets here, I have actually listed them as required. If we do these next 3 steps, there is no reason why we leave an employee behind. There's no reason why we forget about an employee's time. There's no reason of not knowing an employee is going to get paid or not. So the first thing we're going to focus on is on the timesheets. Timesheets have a functionality there where you can sort by status, and this is where I'm going to show you how to submit a timesheet using that status column. After we do that, we'll review the payroll summary screen. This is a screen that you'll be able to go in there and see how many employees are not ready for payroll. And this is the one I've stressed on prior webinars, that if you see anybody listed there as not ready, that should be an automatic sign for you to let you know that we have a problem with this employee, and therefore this employee would not be pulled over by corporate payroll into JD Edwards when it comes time to do the final payroll process. Then lastly, you have a payroll register report. This is going to display all employees and their payroll status by pay group. So you're quickly going to be able to tell who's going to get paid, who's not going to get paid, and what their gross amounts are. So keep in mind, Blueforce only shows the payroll as it stands, as that is ready, and as it stands for gross. That's basically the gross amount before taxes, before deductions, before any benefits, etc. So Blueforce is only going to show the gross total for every employee. So the first part of this is the timesheet view. And the timesheet view, as I mentioned, is where you're actually going to spend probably a lot of your time in reviewing and making sure someone has actually been submitted and approved. Now, real quick, before I go to live little demo on this piece, I want to point out a few things of this timesheet view. And this example on the screen is a little bit more detailed than what I have prepared for you. So first column is the status column. The status column is always going to let you know, who's submitted, who's approved, or maybe who's in an open state. If you see any timesheet still marked as open, that is telling you that nothing's been done with that timesheet. It's open because it has not been submitted, and it's obviously subsequently has not been approved. So status of open is basically a status letting you know that you have full reign of the timesheet. You can still edit. You can do review the time. You can do everything. Nothing's been checked off or submitted at this point. Obviously, like I said, you have submitted. You also have approved. And then if you ever want to review back to see if corporate payroll has pulled over that time, you can go and look and see if it's been exported or not. Now, the way the status column works is you can have, as submitters, you have full reign of making, looking at your reviews, going back to the time card, making adjustments to the time card if you need be, as long as the timesheet is in open state. The minute it is submitted, that timesheet is now locked, and that time is also no longer editable. So that means that whatever hours you have in there, they are locked. Now, from an approver standpoint, you are the next level or next line of defense. You, as the approver, would now go and approve that submitted timesheet. Now, if that timesheet, as an approver, you know that the timesheet has errors, you can always give that submitter a little email or a buzz or a call and let them know that, there's errors. I'm going to reopen. I'm going to basically reject your submitted timesheet, and I'm going to reopen it to allow you to go back in there and make your fixes. So as an approver, you do have the ability to reject and reopen a timesheet. So submitters, whenever there is an issue and maybe you submitted prematurely and you're like, oh crap, I didn't mean to submit it yet, call or contact your approver. The approver can then go in and reopen that timesheet. Now, once the approver has approved the timesheet, the full process is pretty much done from the field perspective. Now, if push comes to shove and there was an issue, the approver can request from the EPAY team and go to the help desk, put in a help desk ticket, and ask for a timesheet to be reopened. Now, that's a little bit of work on the EPAY team side, but it can be done if push comes to shove. The problem we have there is once it's approved, you probably already notified corporate payroll or tell them that, you know, you're done with payroll, go ahead and proceed with the corporate payroll process. And if you've done that, we cannot go in there and do anything with your approvals, because more than likely the status would have been already changed to exported. Once time is exported out of Blueforce, that timesheet, everything has been sent over with the employees that have been sent that were ready, and anybody that may have been left behind at that point becomes an interim check situation where you have to go through the manual timesheet to then go through and key in time to make sure they get paid properly. So just keep that in mind. The status column tells you a lot as far as what is the status of that particular timesheet. The goal here as an approver, obviously as a submitter, you want everything to say submitted. As an approver, you want everything to say approved. The next column is the open punch column. The open punch column is going to let you know how many open punches are reflected here and require user intervention in order to be corrected. So if you have an open punch, that is the example of an open punch is basically an employee's punched in but did not punch out, or maybe you had an issue with a unauthorized phone number being used, so the system marked it as approved pending. All these scenarios, they're open punches. You can submit, you can approve a timesheet with an open punch, but those open punches do not get paid. The system does not calculate those into the final calculations, and they stay there as open punches. They must be corrected, and I urge you to pay attention to this column, because if you see any number in red there, that is your signal that you have time that possibly could not or will not get paid during the payroll process. So make sure all your open punches are corrected. Now, the one thing I will show you about this screen is a lot of you will quickly know how many hours in a work week do you need to have in order to have a pretty much successful payroll. So the hours are always going to be noted here by task. You see the task here, and then by job, and the job is kind of hidden right back in here. But the job will actually, job and task is how the hours are broken out. So you can kind of see that this job had, I'm going to go to this one down at the bottom, had 4.5 hours total for all tasks for this job. However, if you break it out, 1.5 went to this landscape other task, 3 went to this main work order task. So you've got a couple ways of breaking out and seeing how many hours you should have on your job. And I kind of leave this pretty vague because many of you in your phone call don't actually go down the task level to kind of estimate hours like that. Most of you just kind of look at a bigger level at the job, kind of a job level. So you've got some options there as far as how to kind of look at your detail on your timesheet view. So kind of going further with this as well, the bottom line to keep in mind when you're actually going through your timesheet is you have a date range at the very top of the screen that kind of dictates what timesheets you see. Your timesheets are based by week. So if you have a weekly pay period, you're going to have one timesheet every week that's going to be submitted and approved. If you have a multiple timesheet week, for example, you have a bi-weekly pay period, then you're going to submit and approve 2 timesheets every week. As submitters, we ask you that you do your submissions by noon on Monday, if at all possible. This gives the approver any time to, plenty of time to finish the process on that Monday afternoon into Tuesday morning at the latest. But bottom line, if you can do it on if you're doing your daily reviews like you're supposed to, there's no reason why you can't submit your time first thing when you get to the office or start work on Monday. So this is just kind of overview of that timesheet view. So real quick, let me go ahead and get over to Blueforce, and let me see if I have to re-log in here because I've been sitting idle for a little bit. And no, I don't. So perfect. So what I've done here is I've logged in as a test submitter that I have in this employee that I set up in the system. And this is the submitter screen that all your submitters and a lot of the approvers on here, even the editors, will see. Very similar screen. Now the editors have the same access of going in as a submitter. The only difference between those two roles is the submitter has the little option to submit. And when that submit basically says you reviewed the time, you've checked off, you approved it, whatever you want to call it, and it goes on down to the approver for the second set of eyes to look at and make sure that there's nothing been missed from the approver role. And they sign off on the final payroll by hitting approved, and that sends that information over to corporate payroll for processing. So the first thing I would draw to your attention here is the timesheets icon in the middle of the screen. Now keep in mind that the time cards icon, listed here with the clock, this one first is where you're going to go in and look at all the work time. So anytime an employee punches in and punches out and has worked time, that's where you're going to look at that work time in time cards. That's where we actually see the in and out punch. Now timesheets is where you're actually going to go and see the summarized time. So for example, as a refresher, the time cards is going to show you an employee punched in at 7:54, punched out at 3:21. And then the timesheet view is going to show you, instead of the actual in and out punch, the timesheet view is going to give you the summarized or total time actually the employee worked for that day. So in that case, it'll say, for example, 7.5 hours will be shown in the timesheet view. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to go into timesheets now, and as just a real quick, like I said, this might be a refresher for some of you, but when we go into the timesheet view, you'll be able to go in here and see, a specific job. If I want to see all jobs, I can, or I have the ability of selecting a specific job. I have the ability of telling what date range I want to work with. So let's say I want to work with the period before, which is the full period is the 29th of April through the 5th of May. And then I will then go and hit search. And when I do that, the system's going to return all the timesheets that have time currently for those those days in that particular period of the 29th or the 5th. Now keep in mind, one of the fields that you have at the very top of the screen is the show blank timesheets button. I always say leave this alone. If you go ahead and check that, you're going to see extra timesheets, basically all the timesheets that are out there with 0 time attached to it, and that kind of muddies up the screen here. And I'll point that out because that was a recent help desk ticket. Why am I seeing so many timesheets? Well, you have this checked off on your screen there, so don't check it, leave it completely blank. Otherwise, it muddies up the kind of view here. The other option I want to point out here is you have some filters or some drop downs that you can actually select. So for example, I have all selected jobs currently on the timesheet view, but maybe I don't want to see all jobs. I only want to see the 100 My Main Office only. I don't want to deal with the other Whataburger job that I have on that particular screen. And that's fair enough. That's a valid point to make. If I need to, I can hit the drop down and I can pick the job that I want to work with specifically. Once I pick that one job, hit search again, and that'll only reflect that one job. So you can kind of filter and kind of play around with that particularly. Now there's 2 ways as a submitter, once you get used to this kind of the filters and getting down to what you want to work with. And once again, I'll hang on to that thought real fast, but when you go into as a submitter, the one thing I have to mention is you want to go through and see what the status is on that particular timesheet. Now, if I go in here and look here, I'll see the status of open. That status is letting me know that that timesheet is awaiting me as a submitter for now, so that I can now go in there and approve it. Now, when I go in there and approve it, I can simply click on the job link, under the column that says job. I have the job number or job number name currently highlighted or circled right here, and you'll see it's underlined in both of these cases. Now, if I want to actually go in there, the original way that I actually addressed this particular way of submitting, and most of you who have gone through and worked with either myself or Tiandra initially through some of our webinars that we've had in the past with submitting time, we've asked you to go into the actual job record by clicking on that job link and then going in there and hitting submit on the actual employee record. On the actual job there. So in here, when I go in to the actual job record, you'll see down below that I actually see all the employees' time. So these are my employees. This is the time they actually worked. This is the actual rate type they actually worked. And these are the actual job they actually worked. The job is basically equivalent to whatever job is at the top of the screen that I just clicked on to get into this section of the timesheet. Now, all in all, you have a way to view the hours in summary. If you have any questions, for example, I want to know what makes up the 7.5 hours that's here on Tuesday, because he's showing I've only worked 4 hours and 4.25 hours that day like everybody else. I can actually click on that 7.50 and it'll actually take me to the actual timesheet, the time card, so I can actually see the actual in and out punch. I can actually determine, oh, okay, I see he punched in, he punched out, etc. Now, the coloration here obviously also dictates what's happened here. I added these a little while ago before our webinar today, so these times are all yellow because they were up here based on the color code. They were added from the web. That basically means that someone manually added that time, or that's referred to as a manual punch. So with that, bottom line, you have the ability of reviewing the hours here. So as a submitter, as approver, you can just go in here and just review the hours, see, yep, 32 hours sounds good, 38.5 sounds good, etc. Now, one thing I want to point out to you, notice here, before I go into submit, Edward, my employee, worked regular time of 38.50 hours, but he's also showing overtime of 4.33 hours. How is that possible? Well, keep in mind that when you actually go into the actual timesheet for a specific job, you're only looking at one job in question. So by only looking at that one job, you're only looking at job 100. So if that employee worked multiple jobs, it may not be reflected here. All you know is he worked regular time of so much on this job, and he worked so much overtime on this particular job. So you keep that in mind. In this case, he actually probably did something else weird, or maybe I'm messing around or tinkering with some special rule in the system. But bottom line, actually what it equates to this particular example is anything over 8 hours in a day. In this particular job rule is that anything over 8 hours in a day is overtime. So you'll see that he worked 8 hours there plus 1, 8 hours on Friday plus 2.83, 8 hours on Thursday, and then 8 hours on Friday at half an hour overtime. So don't get confused. It's all based on the actual rule. And once again, I go back to the overtime rules I talked about. Is we had that all set up in the system. We've verified it. We've kind of do our due diligence, I guess, on the overtime rules before we actually turn it loose to the system. So overtime rules are calculated based on what was set up. Now, bottom line, let me go back a step here because I know I talked a little bit about this screen just here. So I'm going to go back to timesheets. When you initially go to the timesheet view, you can submit one of two ways. The way that we typically show you first, kind of the novice or the entry way of doing this. Once you get used to the timesheet, there's other ways of submitting and approving. But initially, we tell you to go into the job record by clicking on the job link. And then at the very top of the grid, you have the option of seeing the status, which is currently open. And right next to it, you have a underline link that says submit. If you are a submitter, you will have access to seeing that submit there. Those that are editors on this phone call, you will not see or get that option to submit. So don't fret because you do not have the submitter rights. Once I click submit, I will be prompted with a little message up here that says, I cannot find any recipient for notification. What that is letting me know is that it has now been approved. It's been submitted, and the notification is going to go to the approver. If an approver is set up for this particular job, you will automatically, that approver is going to get an email, a notification letting you know that so-and-so has submitted and now awaits your approval. Now, what this also does for you, and this message right now is telling you cannot find it, because either I don't have an approver set up, which is not the case, or secondly, I simply don't have an email address associated with that approver in the system. So if you get a purple notification like this, don't worry about it. This is letting you know that that person who's receiving the notifications may have opted out of getting notifications. Because if you're doing 20 submittals individually like this, that's going to generate 20 emails to this approver. Now, if I go back to the timesheets view, you're going to see that status now is submitted for that particular first timesheet on my list. Submitted right there. Now, the other one is still open. So is there another way I can submit time? Well, yeah, I can go back into that job and submit like I did a little while ago, or as I'm going to show everyone on this phone call, is you can actually just vet out all the ones that need to be submitted by simply clicking open on the timesheet status dropdown. When I go and click on open, hit search again, the system is only going to return the timesheets that are in an open state, meaning these are like a checklist now. These are the ones I have to submit. Notice I only have one on the list that needs to be submitted. Now, this is the one I will stress to everybody that if you go in here, you can now check individually on every timesheet the ones that you want to submit, and basically by doing one click. So in one fell swoop, you can do everybody and do all the timesheets and submit them. Now, there also is a kind of a select all right at the very top. That select all will select all your timesheets in one fell swoop. Now, here's the caution I'm going to throw to you when I talk about this. Pay attention to the open punch column before you do anything. If you see any open punches, do not submit for everybody. If you see any questions about errors, any questions as far as the number of hours calculated or the overtime hours showing there, do not click submit timesheets. Do not select that particular timesheet. The reason being, once again, once you hit submit, it locks up the timesheet. No edits can be done no further on that timesheet. And now it goes to the approver. So this is your check as a submitter, your opportunity to say, wait, I'm not ready. I need to take a step back and find out what's going on. But I'm showing this route because this gives you a flexibility. If you've done your checks, you've done your daily reviews, and you feel comfortable with your time that's being reflected on the timesheet, you can quickly come here. First, do the timesheet status to open. Next, go to search. And then when you do that, you can come in here and check the different boxes or the select all to submit all your timesheets at one point. Once I have them all checked off, I then come in and will click on submit timesheets. I'm going to do select all there. And then I have the ability now of coming in and simply clicking on submit timesheets right here at the very top of the grid. Once I do that, it'll submit all the timesheets in one big move. So let me go ahead and do that right now. Hit submit timesheets. And now all of them are now submitted. Now they disappear off your screen. You do not lose them. Keep in mind that your view is filtered. Your view is filtered to show only open right now. So if I change my filter now to something else, so if I go back to my filter here and now change it to show me everything that's been submitted, hit search again. Now I'll see all the ones that are submitted. So as an approver, for those that are approvers on this phone call, you would then now come in here, do a select all, and then you'll have the ability to approve. Now I cannot approve and submit because that is a segregation of duties. That's why we have two different roles there. Notice that when I came in here to hit search, I didn't get an option to approve all my timesheets, which should appear right up in here. And that does not get, I don't have the option because this user is not an approver. But the approver will treat the same way. You select them all, click on approve timesheets, and proceed. This is a quick way of doing it, but I would urge you, if you don't feel comfortable doing it in mass like that, do not go in there and click all and select all and then approve all or submit all at one time. Now, one of the questions I got is, can the system decline a submission if there's an existing open punch? Really, no, because there are some times, and I will tell you that occasionally there may be some open punches out there that you say, you know what, they're fine, they're not hurting anything. The employee actually double punched. We just didn't fix it. Let's go ahead and approve it, or submit it first and then approve it. So the system is wide open to that fact. So just keep in mind, if you see an open punch there, just address it. It doesn't hurt you to zero it out. I mean, if that's a valid, maybe it's a double punch situation where you can really want to zero it out or need to zero it out, then by all means zero it out. But unfortunately, the system does not have a way of saying, I have an open punch, I need to stop the process. I'm not going to allow submissions, because occasionally there might be a point where you need to rush that payroll through and you want to submit it. So the answer is no right now. There's no stopping you from submitting. And that's kind of just a quick overview of the timesheet screen. I mean, it's not difficult at all. It's just a matter, I like to tell everyone, start using the timesheet status to your advantage. Because down the road, if you ever need to see if your time actually was exported, maybe you look at your employee comes to you and says, hey, I didn't get paid. Like, what do you mean you didn't get paid? Let me go over here and see what's going on. If that whole job was missing, you go in here and say, I want to see everything that's exported. you have the ability of seeing everything that was exported. Right now, I have nothing exported state. That means that nothing right now has gone over into JD Edwards for payment. It's still sitting in Blueforce. Now, another part of the payroll readiness process, and there's a couple of questions there. I think I've answered them, but if I didn't, I can always come back to the screen here in a little bit. The next part of that process is that you also have some reports if you wanted to run. Now, let me go back before I actually go for finish these last slides here. Let me go back to screens here. Right up here at the top right-hand corner, when you're in the timesheet view, you have the ability of exporting a quick report. The export summary is going to show you everything summarized, just like you see down here. It's going to show you the jobs, it's going to show you the hours, it's going to show you the tasks, everything in a summary view. If you want to see what made up those 170 hours, and this is my example here on my screen, then you can do the export details button, and that's going to actually export those timesheets with all the detail. Who clocked in, how many hours per day, what task. I have a few users around the country that are actually using the export details to provide a report back to the customer with detail as to what task, who worked how many hours, etc. And that works perfect. But that's the export details option. And I just want to point those out because from time to time we'll get a request for a report. Well, you have the ability to do a quick ad hoc report, kind of an Excel report, by using those two options, export summary and export details. But just real quick, timesheet highlights should be something that all submitters and approvers are looking at. Should be everything you do when you do for closing out your payroll. You have filters that are available for you. You can sort by status, which I recommend. And you can also go in there and make sure that all of your time is based on approved. So if the status of approved is not on your timesheets, then you have some issues that you need to correct. And you'll notice on the next step here of the payroll process, you can cache those there as well. Open punches are listed. Your hours are shown by task. And if you need to, you can run a quick report. Now, the next part of that is you have a payroll summary screen that you also look at. Once everything has been submitted and approved, you can go into the payroll section and see what the different pay groups that are involved. And notice that all these little groups have little plus signs in front of it. You can just click on the little plus sign to expand that group. You'll see the pay group that's underneath there. But part of this process or this step, you should get to see how many employees are not ready for payroll. Pay attention to the not ready for payroll. If you see anybody that says under your pay group there that's not ready for payroll, that is telling you that those people that are listed under not ready for payroll will not get paid. That means that everybody else is going to go over into go into JDE from Blueforce via the interface. Their time is going to be all sent over, except for those that are not ready for payroll. If it says not ready for payroll here, you're going to have some unhappy customers, some unhappy employees down the road when they don't get paid on payday. And the way this works is simply putting your date range at the very top of the screen. What's the range of the pay period you're looking for? And as you go through there, you can go through and see how many are ready versus ready. So for example, this last one on the list here shows I have 8 ready for payroll, but only 3 that are not ready. That means you'll have 8 happy employees, you'll have 3 unhappy employees because they're not ready for payroll. If I click on not ready, it will actually tell me who those employees are and kind of give you insight as to what the possibility is as to why they are not ready for payroll. So to that, this particular screen is really what I refer to as the approver's lifeline. As an approver, before you call corporate payroll and say, hey, I'm done with payroll, go ahead and start processing, go through here and check. Make sure that everyone is submitted, make sure that everyone's been approved, and make sure that there's nobody that's still sitting in there with a not ready status. Specify your date range. Like pay groups are going to be grouped together for ease. You can expand them and class them as needed. But this basically is there because it's going to show you a summary of hours and dollars by rate type, and it's going to show you the number of employees not ready for payroll. Once again, if it says not ready, click on it. You can drill down and actually see who those employees are that have issues. And lastly, the ability to submit all and approve all is there as well. Now, I got a good question, and the good question here says, can pay groups be cleaned up? Well, first off, in this particular view here, only the pay groups, when you expand these little groups, only the pay groups that have active hours are going to show up in there. So you're not going to see everything that's out there. But we do understand that there are some pay groups that are looming out there that are not used that probably should be cleaned up. Now, some of the problems with that is, yeah, we can clean out some pay groups, but if there are active pay groups that are used by other, let's say others in your area, or within maybe you share pay groups with other companies or areas around the company or branches, there's all these different terms for different offices. In those cases, we cannot just disable or delete a pay group. So you may see some, I think everybody's probably going to see this one circle on the screen here is called test, because that was a test pay group that was initially set up with a lot of the jobs that are out there. There is some cleanup we can do, yes, but I'm just kind of forewarning you that you cannot just get rid of all the pay groups that are out there in most cases. But we can look at that. So, you know, I won't call you out by name, but you know who you are, who asked the question. We can look at that in a little bit more detail offline. So let us go to the very last step, the last option that's available for you, and that's the payroll register report. Now, as a final check, all approvers on this phone call, I implore you to run this payroll register report. Once again, it's off of the payroll section, just so where we were just at. But instead of doing the payroll summary link on the left-hand column like we just referred to a little while ago, you're actually going to click on payroll register. And that payroll register report allows you to put a date range here, and then it allows you to choose the pay groups you want to use. Now, this is where you might see you know, other pay groups that maybe you don't always use, but these are pay groups you have access to seeing. So you go through here and check the ones you want to use, and then you want to click at the bottom, generate report. Now, when you click on generate report, the system's going to run through and basically send you create an Excel version of that particular report for your use. Now, it's an Excel format. You can actually decide if you want to put it into Excel from there, or if you want to actually see it as which is a CSV file for Excel, or if you want to see it as a PDF. But in either case, you have the option to select that form at the top of the screen. And then from that, you can now see all of the information for that particular you know, payroll register report, in this case, for that particular pay period. So I can go through here and see pay period, I can see pay groups, I can see the employee, who the employee was, what their default job was, if that makes a difference. And you can see the hours, you can see the dollars, you can see the status, and this is a big one. If you go through here at this point and still see not ready for payroll after you're done your other checks, then you need to stop and reanalyze this and go back and look at that employee, because if it's not ready here, it should have been not ready in the prior window, the payroll summary screen, and that still means that that person will not get paid when that time transfers to Blueforce. I mean, it's to JDE from Blueforce. Another thing to keep in mind is all your employees must say exported yes. If there's any no's in there, that means that that employee time does not go into JDE. I want to point that out because anybody who is a salaried employee is not required to use Blueforce to punch in and punch out. However, some sites, some areas do have their employees that are salaried do record punches for basically the purposes of coding labor to the proper job. And that's done on JD Edwards. Now, I'm sorry, that's done on the Blueforce side. However, if they are set to export no, which all salaried employees are, there'll be no on this particular column called export employee, and their time will not go to be paid over in JD Edwards because they're salaried employees. We have them set up to, you know, not get an extra pay, or they got their salary already noted over in JD Edwards. So from the perspective of Blueforce and coding time properly, you can still have employees punch in, punch out. You can have salaried employees allocate time in Blueforce. The reporting in Blueforce, the Hubble reporting that also we have, all comes from Blueforce. So the calculations and all the spread of time and allocation of time would show up correctly. Just keep in mind that salaried should stay exported to no here because we do not want their time going over to JDE. And then lastly, we want to make sure that everyone that needs to get paid is shown as active as yes. If you see anybody with a no, there's no, I'm going to say this, for example, this employee was a no, Von Ancheta, that employee would not obviously get to JDE because it's a no. The system would send the time over. It would fail because they're not active. They would not get paid or funded a pay card or print a check on JD Edwards. So this payroll register report does one last check, gives you one last piece of information, last one chance to do anything before we say yay to funding payroll. So bottom line, should be always run by the approver. It's a vital step in the process. Make sure everyone says ready for payroll. Remember, not ready is not good. And then keep in mind that it provides you hours and dollars to be paid. It gives you a picture of what is going to get paid out. If you know that now an employee, from an approver standpoint, you may not know the employees firsthand, what they did in the field, but you do know that they are entitled or set up to actually get some pay that week. It gives you insight they are going to get paid. Make sure the export column is yes. Make sure the active column is yes. And once again, as I said, if you want to share that report with somebody or just save it off on your computer, you can export that out as needed. So kind of going through today, I went through the overtime process, went through the kind of basic payroll readiness. These are 3 steps you want to do as a submitter and or approver. And keep in mind that if you have any questions, any concerns, you want to follow up with anything specifically here, we urge you to. Our EPAY team is on standby, ready to assist. And I would just ask to go through and with a help desk ticket or call the help desk phone number there. And we ask the help desk ticket be created just because we want to ensure that we do not misplace your or maybe don't see your end user request by sending an email box or a voicemail box. So do us a favor, put in a help desk ticket. We'll be happy to answer any questions or even work with you one-on-one or more detail with these particular items we've discussed here on today's call. So as always, I want to say thank you for joining me today. We'll do another session, identical session on this Thursday coming up at 2 p.m. Central, and then we'll re-up with a different topic next week, once again on Tuesday and Thursday. So thanks again for joining me today, and we'll catch you on our next webinar.